What's up, TTM fam? Eric here for episode 4, which we are now getting into, my early adulthood. My teen years are now over, graduated high school. Um, Thought about college. However, college really wasn't for me because of my grades and financial situation at that time. So I became, a worker, working 3 jobs, a couple of retail, working overnight as a gas station attendant, but we'll get more into that later. Um, kind of reflecting on, my teen years, um, really just kind of becoming a chameleon about, where I could fit in, what I could do, who I could hang with, like, and how I could just kind of fly under the radar. Um, but in the same token, that's just what it was. When you don't get any real guidance, like you're left to your own devices, and that was one thing for me that I ended up doing. Because now, as turned 18, adulthood, now I'm into my early 20s, where starting off, from being 19, working full time. At that point, I had moved out, got an apartment with 2 high school friends. Well, I was in the process, excuse me, of getting an apartment with 2 high school friends. One, it started off being my buddy. We're like, hey, we want to get an apartment, great. We got it all lined up, and then his crush from high school was just like, oh, you guys are getting a place, and she wanted a place to stay, and she ended up joining us, which at that time it was cool, you know what I mean? We had 2 bedrooms, so me and him bunked together while she had her own room. Was it weird? Hey, a little bit. But in the same token, was what it was. It only lasted a year. But during that time, like I was working retail, and then it was exploring relationships. And when I was 19, I lost my virginity. Um, so it was, being a late bloomer, finally kind of building the confidence and, you know, making it happen. It was me, instead of being the chameleon, was trying to find my identity and what was working, what would work for me, during that time. Um, but using, again, emotional survival skills that were running me because, again, there was no guidance. So it was kind of all learning as I went, feet to the fire, and just making kind of those decisions. Um, you think, oh, you have your own place, you have my car, my own insurance. I was paying for everything, and hey, I really have things under control. When no, I didn't. This is when alcohol became a big factor in my life because as I was getting older, when I moved out, I wasn't under mom and dad's roof anymore. I was under my own. So, I was the last one to turn 21 in my friends group. My other 2 buddies turned 21 in the same month. So, one of them wasn't a big partier. My best friend wasn't. My other best friend, he liked to party. Like that's how we kind of got along as we got older. But when I turned 21, I thought I had everything because I was going out constantly. Going to the local bars, hanging out with people, trying different things, trying drugs. It was really a big exploration for me. Um, and come to find out, it was kind of um, it turned up being a really bad path for me in my early to mid 20s. I got into a lot of trouble because of drinking primarily. Drugs, I tried a fair, a decent amount of drugs, like kind of your accessible ones. However, um, they just didn't stick. Alcohol to me was freeing. Um, it it allowed me to speak my truths because that's what alcohol does. It gives you liquid courage, um, and you lose your inhibition, so to speak, to um, kind of hold your filter back. And there's a lot of, with me kind of suppressing everything, there was a lot of pain um, that kind of came out, and whether it was a social setting, whether it was a private setting, whether it was at a bar, um, it was, that's when really, kind of relationships, were formed, were broken. I had a good amount of, you know, companions, throughout that time frame. I had serious girlfriends, throughout that time frame as well. But, unfortunately, the alcohol at the time ruined it because it made me not the person that I wanted to be. Um, because it wasn't, um, when I drank, I wasn't in control. I wasn't one of the types that could sit there and have one beer. It was, at one point, excuse me, I was drinking a 30 pack a day, and that was going to work. At that time, I was working like the early shift, 5A to like 1, 5A to 1P. And then I would get home, go to the liquor store, buy a 30 pack, you know, sit in my apartment, crack them open, and just drink two at a time because I had these big steins that I used to keep in my freezer. And I would pour the beers in, and they'd just go down like water. Before I knew it, 30 pack was done, and I was drunk and, out cold by, 8, 9 o'clock at night, only to wake up the next day at 3:30 to start it all over again. Excuse me. So, yeah, it really, with the drinking, from the time I was 21, getting arrested um, for DUIs and multiple. Um, one when I just probably, let's see, what was that, 9 months after I turned 21, and then another one a couple of years later, and then um, there was one instance where I ended up hanging out with my ex-fiance, girlfriend, fiance. We were engaged, but that was a very volatile um, relationship, uh, simply because of me, you know, um, and how I acted and what I did. Um, I didn't have the answers, and then one day we tried sort of, bringing it back together. And I remember we went down to a bar by, her place, and for some reason or another, we kind of got into a verbal altercation, and from there it was, we left, um, and I met her down. It was where she worked, because she worked part time as a waitress for extra money. Her regular job, she was actually a firefighter, paramedic, but at night she would be a waitress. And I remember meeting her down there, and then at the time she was just like, "Oh, you know what? You've had too much to drink. Let me take you back to my house." And then um, then we got into an argument there, and I remember leaving the house and just figuring out like how I'm gonna get my truck because that's all I wanted to do. I just wanted to leave, and I remember showing back up at her house. She had the door locked. Um, I just remember taking one step, and I dropped a shoulder into the door, and just to go in to get my keys. That's all that I wanted. Um, and from that point, it was I got my keys, um, and I ended up taking my truck. home, and I remember at that time I was working to get my CDL Class A license, and about a week before I was supposed to go take my test, I get a summons in the mail, and basically say, hey, listen, you know what, there's um, if you don't report to this courthouse, you're going to be, you know, arrested. So at that point, that was, you know, kind of a defining moment for me. Um, I'd already had, two strikes. Now this was kind of the third. Um, and with that being said, it wasn't who I wanted to be because sitting there and kind of explaining, sitting there and say, hey, I can't take the CDL test. Well, why? Well, because I got to go to court. Oh, why? And it was just being a disappointment. Once again, I had to go through that whole rigmarole and that whole thing and probation and all of it, and I was just sick of it. I really had just become enough. And um, I remember trying to talk to her and say, hey, listen, don't press charges. you know I you know I don't need this. Like, I'll pay for the door. I paid for the door, and everything that came into, but still, you know it stuck. And I have to say that point there was my wake up call. That was me saying, um, you can't do what you want to do, and unfortunately, having that as a daily reminder that because of the choices that you made isn't necessarily good. It's either you're going to be dead, you're going to be in jail, or do you want to be a productive member of society? And I chose the latter. So I remember giving myself kind of like a last hurrah, and the following day I stopped drinking. And since then I haven't drank in, was it '06? So we're looking at 19 years. So next year will be the big 2-0 for being sober um, from alcohol. And it's really molded me to take it one day at a time. Um, and throughout those, it was tough because at that time I only knew how to drink. Like, I only knew how to, converse with people through drinking. And to now have to change that midway was, it was tough. I remember the first get together, um, excuse me, that I had with my football team. We had a banquet, and I wasn't drinking, but I ended up having like something like over 25 Diet Cokes while I was there because my body was just trying to replace the sugar that the alcohol did, and plus the fact that I knew that I couldn't drink, so and I didn't want to, so anything that I could do to not drink was helpful. And then I became addicted to Ben and Jerry's ice cream. I was eating 2 pints of that per day. Um, it took me a while because I did go through a funk of being like, what have I done? I know I'm better than this. However, I made a choice. So when you make a choice like that, and again, coming from a family that we didn't talk about emotions, we didn't talk about the whys. It was just like, well, you made a choice. Now you have to deal with the consequences, and that's what I did. Um, I didn't necessarily have any outlets at that time, but then it was kind of, you know, like I would get in, I would go to the gym, and then I would stop, and then I would start back up, and I would stop, and it was just no consistency with it, and um, so I kind of just was like, you know, um, just move through the day to day of, um, living, which was wake up, go to work, come home, rinse and repeat. And you do that for as long as you have to. Um, and dating from there, it still was, it still was difficult because, um, again, now I had to kind of relearn how to do everything in a sober light. So, with that, it was, instead of suppressing everything and trying to be a people pleaser, I learned to verbalize what was going on, to try and gain some freedom about that. And that's what was, being able to get some freedom was, um, it's vital. But it took me, and it still takes me, time to, get things out and verbalize things and kind of understand what's, what's going on. And it's taken me a lot of years because during that time where I was bad, like those days haunted me. It was, you know, being in my 20s, it's taken me 20 years to try and get to where I want to be, you know, and that's through taking it one day at a time because nothing has ever been easy for me. It's always been um, a harder road than I've wanted it to be, but I believe I was put on that path for a reason. Um, and kind of going through failed relationships, kind of failing as an adult, so to speak. Like I was getting by, but it was just that. There was no other real production out of it. Even when I stopped drinking, it was okay, how do I now acclimate to society? And there was a lot of isolation, um, and because I've always felt like I was a loner, um, just because of how everything was. Yes, I could be in a room full of all of my friends, but still you wouldn't know I was there because I would be the quiet one. I'm an observer, by nature. So, um, and it was just trying to, and still not fully understanding the part to be vulnerable. Um, and not fully understanding that because I never truly looked inside myself to, um, identify that. Especially in my early 20s, it was, what are you doing? Like, why did you make those choices? Because now you just kind of screwed yourself for the rest of your life because you're going to have these things that are going to constantly follow you wherever you go. Background checks, DMV stuff, like all of that stuff doesn't go away. And it all came down to choice that I made. So, um, and those were some hard times, absolutely hard times. Like I had, through relationships, like I had, some majority of them were good relationships. The problem is that I just screwed them up, and I can only blame myself. I tried to do the best I could at that time, but it wasn't nearly enough because I had let alcohol take over. Um, Hopefully, I'm not making you tired as well. um, but I think there's a lot to be learned from that because it's something that I still reflect on to this day. Is certain dates come about, I'm like, oh, hey, this is what happened. This was kind of the change in my life, the course change. So my 20s to say were definitely different. The first half was, and the second half was about rebuilding and trying to stay the course of doing the right thing. Um, Not only for myself primarily, and it's still even after I'd become sober, it wasn't something that was kind of defined. Like I said, when you don't have guidance, and you're left to your own devices, like you're gonna go with what you know. And truthfully, I didn't know much, you know, or fully understand, I should say, what I was doing. Like I knew I had screwed up, but to have this impact me the way that it had was was something that I didn't learn until way down the line. Um, how impactful it was. But, if I can bring anything towards this, it's, the only person that I can blame is myself. I'm not going to put this on my parents. I'm not going to put this on, how I grew up. But, I should have known better. And I didn't. So I had to pay a hefty price. But I also look at it as, I was kind of the catalyst for my friends on what not to do. Like, hey, look at me. Look at what Eric did. Don't do that. And I would tell my friends that, like, it's not worth it. It's not worth it at all. The amount of money, time, embarrassment that I ended up, you know, experiencing. Yeah. So I hope with that is you just, what I can say when you're in your 20s is ask questions, you know, understand your surroundings, understand your, what's going on um, for yourself. Um, because if you don't, it's going to take you a lot longer to kind of figure it out. And by that point in time, whatever damage occurs has happened. But, you know, I just want you to know that, that I know there are other people like me out in this world that have far worse stories. And you know what, I respect those. And this isn't a comparison contest. This is just these are just my thoughts, my experiences, and I bring this so you can understand that you're not alone. You may feel alone, but you're not, because me, along with a lot of other people, have experienced similar instances, and now having to kind of pick yourself up every single day and do the right thing, it's a lot. But just realize in yourself, believe in yourself that you can do it because you will. It may seem impossible at the time, but at the end of the day, you can sit there and look forward and say, hey, I got through today. Now let's focus on tomorrow. You know, so, with that being said, I just want you all to, you know, I mean, this is me kind of, this is my first real walk in the park, um, with the explanations here about my experiences, and I'm definitely raw. So, excuse my, inadequacies when it comes down to, making these videos. But, truthfully, it's something that, through my 20s, it was that was really kind of my wake up call. So, and in the upcoming episode, it's, we're going to be going through my 30s, and that's when things kind of, really changed again. So, you know, and one thing I want to close with is if you ever felt like, you felt put together, big air quotes, while falling apart inside, this, that one's gonna kind of be for you to check out. So if you like the content, like the video, subscribe to the channel. We're here. I post videos every Sunday morning, 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And I hope you guys enjoy. Catch you on the next one.